Fanfic Corner, presented by Jennifer. Mercy Thompson. Book 1, Moon Called. Chapter 5, Part 2. Would be forever. The unattainable would be forgiven for thinking that there were only 4 buildings in Aspen Creek: a gas station / post office, the school, the church, and the motel. They wouldn't see the homes tucked unobtrusively up the draws and under the trees. There were a couple of cars in front of the gas station, but otherwise the whole town looked deserted. I knew better. There were always people watching, but they wouldn't bother me unless I did something unusual, like dragging a wounded werewolf out of my van. I stopped in front of the motel office, just under the Aspen Creek Motel sign, which bore more than a passing resemblance to the sign I followed into town. The old motel was built the way the motor hotels had been in the middle of the last century. A long, narrow, no-frills building designed so guests could park their vehicles in front of their rooms. There was no one in the office, but the door was unlocked. It had been updated since I'd been there last, and the end result was rustic charm, which was better than the rundown 1950s tacky it had been. I hopped over the front desk and took a key marked number 1. Number 1 was the Mercrose safe room, specifically designed to contain uncooperative werewolves. I found a piece of paper and a pen and wrote, "Wounded in number 1. Please do not disturb." I left the note on the desk where it couldn't be missed. Then I returned to the van and backed it up to the room. Getting Adam out of the van was going to be rough no matter what. At least when I dragged him into it, he had been unconscious. I opened the reinforced metal door of the motel room and took a look around. The furnishing was new, but sparse. Just a bed and a nightstand that were permanently fixed against the wall. Nothing to help me get a werewolf who weighed twice what I did out of the van and into the room without hurting one or the other of us. There was no porch, as there had been at Adam's house, which left almost a 4-foot drop to the back van from the back of the van to the ground. In the end, I decided calling for help was better than hurting Adam worse. I went back to the office and picked up the phone. I hadn't called Sam's number since I left, but some things are just ingrained. Even though he was the reason I left here, he was the first one I thought to call for help. "Hello," answered a woman's voice that sounded completely unfamiliar. I couldn't speak. I hadn't realized how much had changed since how much I've been counting on hearing Samuel until I heard someone else's voice instead. Meryl? Is there something wrong at the motel? Do you need me to send Carl? She must have caller ID, I thought stupidly. She sounded frantic, but I recognized her voice at last and felt a wave of relief. I don't know why Lisa Stovall was answering this number, but the mention of Carl and the sudden tension in her voice cued me in. I guess she just had never sounded cheerful when she talked to me. Some things might have changed, but some things I had just forgotten. Aspen Creek had a population of about 500 people, and only about 70 were werewolves. But I seldom thought about the human majority. Lisa and her husband Carl were both humans. So was Meryl. At least she had been when I left. She had also been about 6 years old. I don't know where Meryl is, I told her. This is Mercedes Thompson. There's no one in the motel office. I'd really appreciate it if you'd send Carl down here, or tell me who else to call. I have the Alpha from the Columbian Basin pack in my van. He's badly wounded, and I need help getting him into the motel room. Even better would be if you could just tell me how to get a hold of Brian. Brian didn't have a telephone at his home, or hadn't when I left. For all I knew, he could have a cell phone now. Lisa, like most of the women in Aspen Creek, had never liked me. But she wasn't one of those people who would let little things like that get in the way of doing what's right and proper. Brian and some of the others have taken the new wolves out for their first hunt. Merle's probably holed up somewhere crying. Lee, her brother, was one of the ones who tried to change. He didn't make it. I'd forgotten. How could I have forgotten? The last full moon of October, all those who chose to become werewolves were allowed to come forward. In a formal ceremony, they were savaged by Brian, or by some other wolf who loved them, in the hopes they would rise changed. Most of them didn't make it. I remembered the tension that gripped the town through October, and the sadness of November. Thanksgiving had a different meaning to the residents of Aspen Creek than it did to the rest of America. I'm sorry, I said inaudibly, feeling rawly incapable of dealing with more dead youngsters. I remembered Lee too. Lee was a good kid. I'll send Carl. Lisa's voice was crisp, denying me the right to grieve or sympathize. She hung up without saying goodbye. I avoided thinking or looking at the tarp that covered Mac while I sat in the van waiting for help. Instead, I fed Adam the remaining hamburgers while we waited. They were cold and congealed, but it didn't seem to bother the wolf. When they were gone, he closed his eyes and ignored me. At long last, Carl pulled up next to me in a beat-up Jeep and climbed out. He was a big man, and had always been more of a man of action than words. He hugged me and thumped me on the back. "Don't be a stranger, Mercy," he said, then laughed at my look of shock and ruffled my hair. I'd forgotten he liked to do that. Forgotten the easy affection he showed to everyone, even Brian. Lisa said you have Adam here, and he's in bad shape. Of course he'd know who the Alpha of the Columbian Basin pack was. Adam's pack was closest to Aspen Creek. I nodded and opened the back of my van so he could see what we were dealing with. Adam looked better than he had when I first put him in the van, but that wasn't saying much. I couldn't see the bones in his ribs anymore, but his coat was matted with blood and covered with wounds. Carl whistled through his teeth, but all he said was, "We'll need to tie his jaws shut until we can get him in. I've got something we can use in the Jeep." He brought an ace bandage and We wound it around and around Adam's muzzle. The wolf opened his eyes once, but didn't struggle. It took a lot of grunting, a few swear words, and a little sweat, but the two of us managed to get Adam out of the van and into the room. Once we had him on the bed, I made Carl get back before I unwound the bandage and freed the wolf. I was fast, but even so, Adam caught my forearm with an eye tooth and drew blood. I jumped back as he rolled off his side and struggled to stand, driven to defend himself against the pain we caused him. "Out," Carl said, holding the door for me. I complied, and we shut the door behind us. Carl held it shut while I turned the key in the deadbolt. Unlike most motel rooms, this deadbolt operated by a key from both sides, for just such situations. The windows were barred, the vents sealed. Number 1 served as a prison and a hospital on occasion. Sometimes both. Adam was safe for now. Once he regained a little more strength, things could still get problematic. Unless I tracked down Brian. "Do you know where Brian took the new wolves?" I asked, shutting the back hatch of the van. Carl hadn't asked me about Mac. He didn't have a wolf's nose to tell him what was in the tarp, and I decided that Mac could ride with me for a while longer. Brian could decide what to do with his body. "You don't want to go after him, Mercy," Carl was saying. "Too dangerous. Why don't you come home with me? We'll feed you while you wait." "How many wolves are left in town?" I asked. "Is there anyone who could resist Adam's wolf?" That was the downside to being dominant. If you go moonstruck, you took everyone who was less dominant with you. Carl hesitated. "Adam's pretty weak yet. Brian will be back by dark." Something hit the door and we both jumped. "He took them up to the Lover's Canyon," Carl told me, giving in to the obvious, "Be careful." "Brian will have control of the new ones," I told him. "I'll be all right." "I'm not worried about them. You left enemies behind you, girl." I smiled tightly. I can't help what I am. If they are my enemies, it was not by my choice. "I know, but they'll still kill you if they can."